If it takes 200 years to achieve artificial intelligence, and then finally there is a textbook that explains how it's done, the hardest part of that textbook to write will be the part that explains why people didn't think of it 200 years ago. Because we're really talking about how to make machines do things that are really on the surface of our minds. It's just that our ability to observe our own mental processes is not very good and has not been very good. When we look at Leibniz, he invented binary numbers, but he didn't even invent propositional calculus. That was invented by Boole 150 years later. And then Boole didn't invent predicate calculus. So what one sees is that each step in understanding of thought processes has taken time.
There are several people who are said to be the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, and that's the reason why no woman has come forth and claimed to be the mother of artificial intelligence.
My ideas of artificial intelligence came when I attended a conference, a symposium on cerebral mechanisms and behavior. And one of the things that happened at that conference was a comparison of the brain and computers. Now, it occurred to me that, well, one wanted to program computers to behave intelligently. And I imagined that people had talked about that at the conference. But when many years later I had to give an autobiographical lecture, I went back and read the proceedings of the conference, and I discovered that no one had talked about actually using computers to behave intelligently. My idea was to have a summer study analogous to the summer studies that had been held about some defense problems. So it seemed to me that if 10 people got together and spent the summer, that substantial progress might be made. And so I got 3 other people, Nathaniel Rochester from IBM and Claude Shannon and Marvin Minsky, to join me in submitting a proposal to the Rockefeller Foundation to support a study at Dartmouth for the summer. And for the purpose that the people who came would know what the subject was about. It wasn't automata in general, but was aimed at artificial intelligence, so I called it artificial intelligence. Now, certain things didn't happen as planned. The Rockefeller Foundation gave us only half as much money as we asked for, and most of the people who came could only come for a short time. I thought we would make substantial progress towards human-level artificial intelligence that summer. And we didn't, and human-level artificial intelligence has turned out to be a very difficult scientific problem, and it isn't solved yet. But then it was 100 years from Mendel's work to the deciphering of the genetic code. So people shouldn't be discouraged if it takes a long time.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is artificial intelligence, and we'll be looking at the past and at the future of this very exciting and yet somewhat arcane scientific discipline. With me is Dr. John McCarthy, one of the founders of the discipline of artificial intelligence. Dr. McCarthy is one of the co-founders of the first artificial intelligence laboratory at MIT and the founder of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at Stanford University. He is the inventor of Lisp, the major computer language used for artificial intelligence, and the oldest surviving computer language dealing with symbolic manipulation. He's also the individual who first conceived of interactive computer time sharing. He is the developer of non-monotonic reasoning, an important new form of logically conceiving of the difficult problems facing artificial intelligence today, and he is the 1988 recipient of the Kyoto Prize for his lifetime contributions to the field of computer science and artificial intelligence, something of a Japanese equivalent to the Nobel Prize. Welcome, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Back in 1966, you wrote an article for Scientific American on the field of information, and you projected out at that time what we might see for the next 20 years. And although there were some errors, I suppose, rather accurately described many developments that we now take for granted and which were at that time rather alien to the population at large. So you've witnessed a great deal of the history and the growth of a discipline which has dramatically touched probably everybody's life in the Western world today. And you predicted that it would do so. I wonder if we can begin by just having you reflect a little bit on what these past 20, 30 years have meant to you personally.
Well, I've gotten older. I started my work on artificial intelligence in about 56, although I became really interested in before that in 49 when I was a beginning graduate student in mathematics. I would say that the field has made somewhat less progress than I hoped, although I didn't have any definite opinion as to how fast it would progress. I think that it had and still has difficult conceptual problems to solve before we can get computer programs that are as intelligent as humans.
One of the issues that you're working on, to which most of your life has been devoted, are really tackling these problems, providing the underpinnings so that we can ultimately have formal models of intelligence that would be equivalent to human intelligence.
Well, that's right, and one part of the problem is to develop language in which we can express for our computer programs the facts and reasoning about the common sense world that humans have and that is necessary in order to behave intelligently. And I have worked on this using the tools of mathematical logic.
I think one of the striking things that I find in looking at the history of artificial intelligence is that in the early years there was some striking progress made on some rather difficult problems, like solving mathematical theorems. And people thought, well, because we could do these difficult things, we ought to therefore have no trouble doing some of the simpler things that human beings can do. And yet just the opposite seems to have been the case, that some of the simple things that any child can do, like recognize speech, have been the most difficult problems for computer intelligence.
Well, the idea that one could really do difficult mathematical problems, that is, creative mathematical things, was not really realized. That is, it could do some simple kinds of theorem proving and things like that. Now, it's certainly true that dealing with the common sense world has proved to be quite difficult. What it amounts to is that while humans can do this kind of thing very readily because it's built into us, humans have much more difficulty understanding how it is done in order to be able to make computer programs do it.
You're developing formal models that deal with how human beings do the simplest of things.
Well, there are two ways of looking at things. You can either look at it from the point of view of biology or from the point of view of computer science. From the point of view of biology, you could try to imitate the nervous system insofar as you understood the nervous system, or you could try to imitate human psychology insofar as you understand human psychology. The computer science way of looking at it says that we look at the world and we try to see what problems it presents in order to achieve goals, and think about the world rather than about the biology per se. And I would say that the computer science approach is the one that so far has had the most success, although these cannot be regarded as alternatives. They're in a race, but they interact with one another. They help one another rather than hinder each other.
Well, in the field of psychology, it used to be during the 50s and early 60s that we thought of the mind as something like a black box. You had a stimulus that went in and a response that went out, and I think it really wasn't until people in your discipline, artificial intelligence and computer science, began looking at how is this information processed, that the psychologists themselves ever felt that they could have a handle on what cognition was all about.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that Newell and Simon, who take an approach rather close to psychology, were the main contributors to getting psychology to move away from behaviorism. Behaviorism was a reaction to 19th century philosophy, which really was very bad, but it went too far in its efforts to be scientific by saying, well, the only things that were properly subjects for science were the things that were externally observable. But when computers came along, then it became clear that you couldn't do it that way. I remember there was an old computer called the IBM 704, and the only stimulus response rule that it had was that if you pressed the start read button, a little yellow light went on. All the rest to understand this computer, you had to know what went on inside. And I guess computers have certainly had a profound effect on psychology.
Yeah. As a psychologist myself, I'm very much a student of William James, who back at the turn of the century began writing about consciousness and the stream of consciousness, and I'm aware that for 50, 60 years his work in that area was pretty much ignored until people in the field of computer sciences began to say that we can have a handle on what consciousness means.
Well, there are many kinds of consciousness. In some respects, computers are easily more self-conscious than human beings. It's not hard to make a computer program look at its own program, but all that people have managed to do with it is to checksum it to see that it hasn't been damaged so far. What's involved in the kinds of consciousness that people would like to program is regarding the self as an object in the world, and considering to be able to think about what progress it's making towards achieving its goals and so forth. And this offers some conceptual difficulties. I certainly wouldn't say that the problem of giving computers self-consciousness is very close to being fully solved.
Well, it raises some very deep philosophical issues. I'm aware of the disputes that took place during the 1940s with Alan Turing, who was one of the founders of the field of computer science, in which he developed the famous Turing test, which suggested that if a computer could imitate a human being to such an extent that you couldn't, if you were sitting at a teletype, know whether you were communicating with a computer or with a real human, then you might as well say that the computer were in fact conscious. Turing responded, as I understand the argument, by pointing out the old philosophical conundrum of solipsism, that we can't even be sure that another human being is conscious, let alone a computer.
Well, I don't remember Turing discussing solipsism, but he did sort of use that as a kind of test as for philosophers. In other words, if you wouldn't admit that something that you couldn't tell from a human was thinking, then maybe there wasn't much more to say. Now, in fact, up to this very day, some of the philosophers are willing to accept behavioral criteria, and others are not. They can say, well, it could pretend to be a human, but it wouldn't really be thinking because it would only be doing what it was programmed to do.
Yeah. Well, one development, and I must confess it troubles me a little bit, that has come out of the information processing models of the mind that are now current, is that we view consciousness as consisting of many components. You have memory, you have emotions, you have different kinds of attention, and sometimes people say, well, consciousness is nothing more than the sum of its parts, so to speak, just like a machine might be. I wonder how you respond to that.
Well, a machine isn't the sum of its parts. If somebody took a car apart and gave you a heap of the parts, that wouldn't be a car. They have to be connected in a specified way and interacting in a specified way. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to say that the mind is a structure composed of parts interacting in a specialized way, I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. But it isn't just a heap of them.
Yeah. It's more of a system.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. But, well, we get into the issue, and I know many people get offended when they think that you could even describe the human being as being equivalent to a system. Like people say, we have something more. We have intuition. We have spirituality. We have something that transcends the mechanistic aspects of our being.
Well, that view has been in retreat for several hundred years as more and more was discovered about human physiology and psychology. And I suppose, maybe one could use the boxing metaphor. It can run, but it can't hide.
Can you elaborate on that? I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there.
There are these aspects of human consciousness that have not been realized in machines, in computer programs, and there are some difficult problems for their realization, but we optimists about AI expect to get to them. Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting story about you. You were a chess player, and back in 1968, you made a wager with a fellow who was then the Scottish chess master that in 10 years, a computer would be able to beat him. And 10 years later, you got together with a state-of-the-art program back in 78, and the computer nearly beat him.
That's right. He won 2 games to the machine's 1. Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, David Levy was a graduate student in computer science, and my intention was not merely to bet with him, but to hire him to work on the chess program. However, he decided he'd really like to publish a magazine on chess rather than continue as a graduate student in computer science. Mm-hmm. I didn't consider the bet by any means a sure thing, but it came close in '78, and now computer programs, this year I believe, or maybe it was last year, a computer program won its first game against a grandmaster. And since David Levy never made it to be grandmaster, probably the current programs could beat him. Although, in my opinion, they used too much brute force in it. And
pure calculating power.
That's right. I would like to see contests that are more like the one design sailboat contests, where it's the cleverness that's involved rather than who can build a monster special purpose machine.
Now this is very important because your work seems to be saying, that in natural human life, we use a lot of mental shortcuts. We don't solve problems by using brute intellectual force. We somehow have rules of thumb that guide us, and you're attempting to develop formalized logic that would enable machines to be able to sort of work in that fashion.
Yes, that's right. And indeed, the collection of problems on which computer brute force can be applied is rather limited. Most of the problems of common sense reasoning are problems where there really isn't that much opportunity to apply brute force, or at least nobody's really figured out how to do so. Mm-hmm. And I would say the central problem of artificial intelligence involves how to express the knowledge about the world that is necessary for intelligent behavior. And I've pursued mathematical logic as the tool. This has had its ups and downs in popularity. Now is definitely an up period. It's quite popular. And part of the reason for that is that in the late 1970s, several people independently, myself among them, discovered ways of formalizing what we call non-monotonic reasoning, which greatly extended the power of mathematical logic in the common sense area.
Now, I know many of our viewers are going to have difficulty with a term like non-monotonic reasoning, and yet it may be crucial to our understanding of some of the developments that await us in the future. So could you expand on that?
Okay. So you have to say what it's non. Mm-hmm. Ordinary logic has the property that if you can draw a certain conclusion from some premises, then if you add more premises, you can still draw that conclusion. So the set of conclusions that you can draw only increase when you increase the set of premises. They don't decrease. Now, human reasoning and what we will have to make computers do doesn't always have that property.
And that's what you would call monotonic.
That's right.
And could you give an example?
Yeah. Suppose we have I tell you that I have a bird that I want you to build me a bird cage for. Then, and that's all I tell you. Then you would draw the conclusion that my bird can fly and that you'd better put a top on the bird cage. On the other hand, if you learn the additional fact that my bird is a penguin, then you would feel that you do not need to put a top on it. So the conclusion that the birdcage required a top depends non-monotonically on the facts that I tell you.
In other words, this is an example of non-monotonic logic, and it has sort of built-in assumptions that I work with. That is, when you use the word bird, I assume it can fly.
That's right. That's the kind of, and that's the sort of convention of English or of other natural languages. If I hire you to build me a bird cage and you build it without a top, and I refuse to pay, and you tell the judge, he never said his bird can fly, the judge will side with me. On the other hand, if you did build it with a top, and I say, well, my bird is a penguin, he wasted material, the judge will side with you, because it's a convention of English that if a bird can fly, it doesn't have to be mentioned, even if it's important. Whereas if a bird cannot fly, then it must be mentioned if it's relevant.
It reminds me of when I was a child. My father would sometimes say things to me. I would ask him a question, and he would say, if you have to ask, if you don't already know, it won't help to tell you. It's that we operate in a world of all sorts of implicit, built-in assumptions and built-in understandings of context everywhere we go. And that is what you mean, I guess, by non-monotonic.
Well, that's non-monotonicity is only part of the context problem. Now that we can formalize some non-monotonic reasoning, we see that, well, there's a good deal more to context than that, and it's, so to speak, the next mountain that has to be surmounted.
So you are attempting to use non-monotonic reasoning as a mathematical tool for building into computers an awareness of that when I use a term like bird, I don't have to specify all of its qualities, which ones they have, which ones they don't have, in a straight, I would say linear, or you would say monotonic specific form.
That's right. Suppose you want to be able to reason about birds flying, and then you might say, well, I'll put in the exceptions, ostriches and penguins and so forth. And then someone comes along and says, well, what about a bird with his feet encased in cement? And then you can see that, well, you couldn't possibly put in all the exceptions, because if you put that one in, I'll invent another exotic exception that you wouldn't put in. So what you have to do instead is go to a system where you will assume that the bird can fly unless you have some evidence to the contrary.
Now this seems, I have to tell you, it seems very simple to me. Yet you're describing this as somehow something new in the world of computers.
Well, that's right. And what I believe is that if it takes 200 years to achieve artificial intelligence, and then finally there is a textbook that explains how it's done, the hardest part of that textbook to write will be the part that explains why people didn't think of it 200 years ago. Because we're really talking about how to make machines do things that are really on the surface of our minds. It's just that our ability to observe our own mental processes is not very good and has not been very good. And we can look at that historically. When we look at Leibniz, who was an extremely smart scientist, he was the co-inventor of calculus with Isaac Newton. He wanted to make a logical calculus that would permit calculation instead of argument. And he invented binary numbers in this case, but he didn't even invent propositional calculus. That was invented by Boole 150 years later. And then Boole didn't invent predicate calculus. So what one sees is that each step in understanding of thought processes has taken time.
In fact, what you're saying reminds me very much of the story of Socrates, who went around questioning people in all of the different professions in Greece 2,500 years ago, and discovered that while these people were quite competent at what they did, he said, well, they're all ignorant. None of them can tell me how they do what they do, when he questioned them closely. And you seem to be engaged in a process very much like, you know, the second step beyond what he was doing.
Yes, well, Socrates was, as I understand it, mainly interested in demonstrating people's ignorance. But now we're really trying to say, well, how can we make computers actually carry out these processes?
So it's a whole different program.
That's right, yeah.
In a sense. What is your sense of the likely future? You described 20 years ago how with computer time sharing we would all have access to information utilities, and that has come to pass. And I don't want to pin you down to a specific date, because I realize you couldn't say honestly, but what are the sorts of things that are achievable?
Well, as I say, I think there are conceptual breakthroughs that have to be made. And the extreme is that, well, some smart young fellow has just done it. He just hasn't told us yet. And the other extreme is that it may take a couple hundred years, maybe 500 even, depending on how many conceptual problems there are. That is, it might take 500 years before we have computer programs that are as intelligent as human beings. Now, I'd really be inclined to bet on something like 50, although very exceedingly unlikely that I'll be around. But I simply don't know how long it will take.
Yeah. But it sounds like you're making a firm bet against the critics of artificial intelligence who say that in theory it's philosophically impossible to
that's right.
replicate human intelligence.
I see their arguments as faulty, and I don't see that human intelligence is something that humans can never understand.
So ultimately, the project that you and your colleagues in the field of artificial intelligence are engaged in, one might view it as the most noble project of all, the one that Socrates actually urged people into, which is to know thyself, and sometimes against great odds to attempt to do what may be, in effect, one of the most difficult tasks facing humankind.
Well, it's certainly a difficult task.
John McCarthy, we're just about out of time right now. I want to thank you very much for coming here and sharing yourself with us this evening. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us.
Today we'll be having a conversation with John McCarthy, Professor Emeritus in the Computer Science Department at Stanford University. McCarthy received the Association for Computing Machinery's Turing Award in 1971 for his major contributions to the field of artificial intelligence. McCarthy coined the term artificial intelligence in his 1955 proposal for the 1956 Dartmouth Conference. He received his B.S. in mathematics from the California Institute of Technology in 1948 and his Ph.D. in mathematics from Princeton University in 1951. McCarthy is well known for his efforts to give computers common sense based on the use of mathematical logic and various extensions to it. He has made major contributions toward what he calls human-level artificial intelligence. McCarthy has also done extensive work in the mathematical theory of computation, especially proving the correctness of programs. He invented the Lisp programming language and made the key proposals and suggestions that led to time sharing. In addition to the Turing Award, McCarthy received the first Research Excellence Award of the International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence in 1985, the Kyoto Prize of the Inamori Foundation in 1988, the National Medal of Science in 1990, as well as several other honors. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Sciences. Perhaps we can begin, John, by talking about what got you interested in science and mathematics in the first place.
Well, I was interested from the time I was a kid.
In high school?
No, even before that.
Even before high school. Somebody told me about a book called The 100,000 Whys. Is that something that had an influence?
Yeah, that was a Russian book. Because of my parents' radical associations, in fact, they were communists, these translations of Russian children's things were popular, and 100,000 Whys is a pretty good book, a popular science book for children. And I read recently that it had been translated into Chinese, and some Chinese child prodigy had learned his science from that.
From that book. Is it still in print, do you think?
What?
Is it still in print?
Evidently.
Probably.
In China, at least.
In China, at least. You read Chinese. Well, so then in high school, before high school and in high school, you had an interest in science, and then you went on to Caltech?
Yeah.
and majored in mathematics there. Any interesting stories about Caltech? No.
Well, there are, but I can't.
Well, you went to this symposium called the Hickson Symposium. You want to say something about that?
Yeah. This was right after I graduated from Caltech. I had some time out in the Army. But my first year of graduate work in math was at Caltech. I moved to Princeton second year. But anyway, in September of '48, there was this symposium on cerebral mechanisms and behavior. And it had various famous psychologists, including Carl Lashley and another one who'd worked with apes, whose name I'm forgetting now.
Kohler.
What?
Kohler?
Yeah, Wolfgang Kohler. And they compared the computer and the brain. And many years later, when I got the Kyoto Prize, and they asked for a retrospective lecture, I went and looked at the proceedings of that symposium. And I had supposed that artificial intelligence had been discussed there, that is, the use of computers to behave intelligently, but at least there was no hint of it in the proceedings. But it was what gave me the idea.
So it played a role for you in getting you interested in the use of computers to imitate intelligence, even though at the symposium nothing much was said about that.
We haggle about the word imitate. Using computers, making computers be intelligent, since we relate intelligence to the ability to do certain things, and independently of whether what does it is a human or a Martian or a mechanism.
Well, that brings us a little bit farther forward, but I remember you saying some things about being interested in the general science of intelligence, independently of how it's mechanized.
Yes, I can't say that I got very far with that.
There are certain principles about what it would mean for there to be a science of intelligence.
Yes.
Now, at Caltech, did you have any contact with computers? These were during the late 40s.
First of all, there was no computer there. The first computers were built in 48 and 49 in England and in the US. And I did attend a few lectures on programming for a computer that was not yet built.
And this would be...
later contemplating, when I actually did learn to program in 1955, I could see that I had acquired some misconceptions in 1948. And if I had been given the opportunity to try to run my 1948 program, it wouldn't have worked.
Well, that kind of programming was what, all in machine language, right?
Yes, I think so.
Because it was certainly before any of the Fortran.
Oh yeah, but before there were actual translators, people would write in a language that wasn't a machine language, and then would hand translate it to machine language. The Russians had a big system for that.
And then, so after 1 year of graduate work at Caltech, you decided to go to Princeton. How come you just didn't decide to continue at Caltech?
Princeton was the best place for mathematics.
Let's see, there were various famous mathematicians there. Von Neumann, for example, but he was at the Institute.
That's correct.
And and then did you get to start working right away on a PhD research?
Yeah, when I arrived at Princeton in September of '49, the department chairman, Solomon Lefschetz, said to me, "What are you going to do your thesis on?" And I said, "I don't know, I'll think about it." And so I immediately got myself a notebook and started thinking about ideas for a thesis. And before the year was up, I had decided on a topic, and this made me relatively popular, because the usual thing is that the students pester the professors to suggest topics.
So you knew about your topic, but didn't have anything to do with computers?
That's correct.
It was...
In a vague sense, it did. In that I got interested in the notion of an integrating factor in differential equations. And the question that I asked myself is, what is an approximate integrating factor? And then what this led to was considering that the gradient of a solution to a differential equation, first order differential equation, belongs to two spaces. One is the space of gradients, and the other is the space of a vector satisfying certain algebraic equation. And that if one projected back and forth between those two spaces, according to a theorem of von Neumann, the process would converge to the gradient of a solution. That was my thesis, figuring out what those operators were. So in some principle, it could have been a method for solving differential equations, but I couldn't at that time show anything about how fast it converged. It was maybe 30 years later before I was able to give an example and show that it converged very, very slowly.
So the problem stayed with you for those 30 years, and then you went back to it.
Yeah, thought about it from time to time.
Now you mentioned von Neumann in connection with doing a theorem that your idea made use of. You talked with von Neumann about all of this while you were there?
I only had one interview with von Neumann, in which I told him some idea that I had about artificial intelligence, representing a brain and its environment by finite automata. And he encouraged me. He said, write it up. But afterwards, after my conversation with him, I came to the conclusion that it was in fact a bad idea, because one couldn't represent knowledge in terms of the structure of the finite automaton, which was to represent the brain. So I didn't write it up.
So you wrote nothing?
Somebody else reinvented it and published it. And yes, it was a bad idea in his hands also.
It was a bad idea then, and still was. Huh?
Yep.
Yeah, well, it sounds vaguely like some of the things that Brooks did with his finite state machines controlling these little creatures.
I don't know about that.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't do anything then about artificial intelligence at Princeton except for that. And you stayed on after getting your PhD, you stayed on at Princeton for a while?
2 years as an instructor.
Mm-hmm. And now let's see. So then you had told me previously you spent some time at Bell Labs during a summer sometime around there.
Summer of '52, yeah.
And there you met Shannon.
Yep.
And you said that that you, let's see, you and Shannon maybe collaborated on doing a volume of papers that you thought
And
would
collecting a volume of papers, yes.
And that volume was Automata Studies.
Yeah.
But let's see, you said you weren't too happy about what all the papers that were submitted.
Well, I was hoping that people would write about artificial intelligence, and one or two did, but a number of them wrote just about automata. And the most famous initial paper on automata, which was Stephen Kleeni's, appeared in that volume. So I really didn't have any right to complain.
It had a famous paper in it. And, but now the phrase artificial intelligence you had proposed later. What phrase were you using to describe your interest in those days in this field that would become artificial intelligence?
Now, I said I didn't have a phrase, but when I wanted to have this Dartmouth summer workshop, the idea was that people would come for the summer and work on artificial intelligence. I had to call it something. So I called it artificial intelligence. And I had a vague feeling that I'd heard the phrase before, but in all these years I have never been able to track it down.
Now, before the Dartmouth conference, you spent some time as an assistant professor at Stanford in mathematics?
Yep.
But anything going on with did you pursue any AI interests during those days?
Certainly I didn't write anything. I wrote on differential equations and analysis, and Stanford decided they'd keep 2 out of their 3 acting assistant professors, and I was the 3rd.
So then Dartmouth was the winner on that one. Dartmouth
perhaps it won, or perhaps it lost.
So you went to Dartmouth as an assistant professor of mathematics, and it was there at Dartmouth that was it you and Shannon and some others decided to propose this Dartmouth summer school?
Well, of course they didn't come up to Dartmouth. I went down to MIT, where Shannon had moved to. And the other person who was instrumental was Nathaniel Rochester of IBM, who was the head of their information processing department.
You had met him earlier?
I met him because IBM decided to give an IBM 704. And the idea was that it would be 1/3 to MIT, 1/3 to other New England colleges, and 1/3 IBM would keep for its own use. And I was the Dartmouth representative.
Part of the other New England colleges.
Yep.
And so that's how you met Rochester?
Well, he came up to Dartmouth as part of his tour, so to speak.
And so how did this idea about having this summer workshop, how did that originate?
Well, I'd heard about these Defense Department workshops. And so I thought that if one could get a lot of smart people, one could make substantial progress in a summer. It turned out to be very much over-optimistic.
So people came for various periods of time, right? Yep.
They
were all of them who participated ever there all at once?
almost certainly not.
So they were there for certain periods of time. And what kinds of things did some of the people do there?
Well, do there is one thing, or report on is another. The people who were furthest ahead at that time were Newell and Simon, who came for just a few days. And I got the idea of list processing from them, but did not at all like the language that they used.
That was IPL?
That was IPL. I thought Fortran was much better. And now one of the things that was done there was that Minsky came up with the idea that a theorem-proving program should only try to prove things that were true in a model. And the example given was plane geometry. So you would have a diagram, and you would only try to prove things that were true in the diagram. And he wrote a little article about this, and Rochester decided that that was a good thing to do at IBM, and got a new PhD, Herbert Gelernter, to work on it, and had me as a consultant. And so I had these ideas about using Fortran for list processing, and Gelernter and his colleague Carl Gerbrich developed it further to this Fortran list processing language.
So they augmented Fortran with some list processing facilities?
No, they didn't do that.
They didn't do that.
What they did was they made some Fortran functions for list processing, but the overall structure was Fortran. And in 1958, when I spent a second summer at IBM, then I decided to write a program for differentiation, and it became clear that the natural way to write it involved recursion, and Fortran did not allow for that. So therefore, when I returned to MIT in fall of '58, it was clear to me that I needed a new programming language.
Well, there are two interesting things about that. One is the list processing. What was there about list processing that recommended it so for applications you wanted to pursue in artificial intelligence? What is there about lists that...
Well, you have data of variable size, and the key thing is that you can match the structure of the data by using lists. For example, a sum can be represented of plus followed by the summands. And so you immediately know that a list structure represents a sum without having to go parsing each time. And that has made for greater power.
And things that are a little more connected with artificial intelligence than arithmetic might be, I suppose representing, say, a theorem in geometry could be done as a list, or representing the axioms.
Well, more generally, any logical sentence also has a structure. It's a conjunction or disjunction or a universal quantification.
And then recursion. Why did you think recursion was going to be important?
Well, if you take the rule given in a calculus text as to how to do formal differentiation, then you have the rule that the derivative of a sum is the sum of the derivatives, which means that if you want to do the derivative and the expression turns out to be a sum, then you have to find the summands and call the a differentiation program on the summands. So that's where
naturally
recursion comes
suggested
in.
itself. And now, in connection with the development of the Lisp programming language, was it the case you had earlier written a paper on computing with symbolic expressions? Did the paper come after Lisp, or did it precede Lisp?
Well, in the middle. Namely, we started on Lisp in the fall of '58. I had to write a quarterly progress report for the Research Laboratory of Electronics that would come out as a report in January of '59. And so I wrote about Lisp in that. And I wanted to show that you could have a universal function, and that it was much more transparent in structure than a universal Turing machine. So I wrote out this eval function just as a kind of mathematical exercise, or to show mathematicians that this was good for this purpose. Mathematicians paid no attention.
That was the germ of the paper.
But as one of the programmers, Steve Russell, did pay attention, he said, yes, if I program this eval in machine language, it will be an interpreter for Lisp.
There you had it.
I was a little skeptical of that, but he did it, and
so that was the first was that the first instance of being able to run a Lisp program then?
well, what we did is we were going to have a compiler, but the compiler was clearly going to take quite some time. So what we did is we had a bunch of conventions and hand compiled into symbolic assembly programming.
Well, here we are at MIT, and you had been at Dartmouth. What was the transition? You could have stayed at Dartmouth, I suppose. How did it happen that you decided to go down to MIT?
Well, John Kemeny, who was the head of the math department at Dartmouth and who had hired me, arranged for me to get a Sloan Foundation fellowship. And I decided to take that fellowship at MIT. And then I double-crossed him by not returning to Dartmouth, but staying at MIT.
And that's when you met Marvin Minsky?
No.
No, oh, you'd met him at the workshop, that's right.
No, much earlier than that. Minsky and I were graduate students in math at Princeton at the same time.
He had done something on neural networks.
That's right. He'd built one at Harvard.
But you then had, of course, worked with him at Dartmouth Summer Conference, and then you actually got involved with an AI project at MIT once you ended up at MIT.
Well, we started the AI project at MIT. We met with, we had a conversation that decided that we'd like an AI project, and who should be coming down the hall but the head of, Jerry Wiesner, who was head of the Research Laboratory of Electronics. We said, we want an AI project. He said, what do you need? And I said, we need a room and a secretary and 2 programmers and a key punch. Mm-hmm. And he said, and how about 6 graduate students?
He had some that he could arrange for you to meet?
He had committed himself to support 6 graduate students in mathematics on a big grant that he'd agreed, big joint services contract. And he didn't know what he was going to do with those 6 graduate students.
He could unload them on you.
That's right.
And Well, these 6 graduate students, they did then come and did they do some work on your AI project?
Yes, they did.
What sorts of programs did they write?
Well, a couple of them were working on the compiler for Lisp. I'm not exactly sure what the others did for us. They wrote their PhD theses in pure mathematical logic, ignoring my ideas about proving programs correct. But then at least 2 of them later went into the field of proving programs correct.
You had mentioned one time to me in conversation about chess endgames. Was that one of those graduate students, or?
Oh yeah. Paul Abrahams wrote a program for 3 move mates and used my proposal for the alpha-beta heuristic in that.
The alpha-beta heuristic, which lots of people claim they invented.
Yeah. Well, Knuth wrote a big article about it in which he discussed who did what. And the complication was that there was a weak form of it and a strong form of it. And he was never able to establish who exactly did what. But both Arthur Samuel for his checker program and Newell and Simon for their chess program had some form of alpha-beta in it, and it may have been the strong form. And my original write-up on it, or well, maybe I wouldn't even say write-up, propaganda about it, had a complication to it where I considered optimistic and pessimistic evaluations.
Now, for people who are viewing this video who might not know what the alpha-beta heuristic is there a way to describe it in lay terms for what it is that it does?
Sure. If the simplest way to describe it would be to use the blackboard, but I don't suppose you want to do that.
So you'll have to speak visually.
All right. Here's the...
Or people could Google it, I suppose, and
I'm sure they could.
look it up on Wikipedia.
Yep. But the basic idea is this. Suppose I consider making a move, and then I consider that if I make this move, the opponent can capture my queen. Then I normally don't consider what else the opponent could do to me. Because capturing the queen is a disaster sufficient that I shouldn't make the move that leads up to it.
Whereas a more naive search process might look at all of these possible moves, right?
Well, the well-defined minimax procedure would indeed do that. And the minimax procedure was built into the first chess programs.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, you had lots of other interests, of course, besides artificial intelligence, theory of computation being one. You've already said something about that and the invention of Lisp. You also had these ideas about time sharing. Can you say something about how you decided to propose some ideas for that, for time sharing?
Well, for AI purposes, what one wants to be doing is to sitting in a terminal at the computer and interacting with your intelligent program so that you can see what it does and make it better. So given the expense of computers
and also the fact that you spend most of your time sitting there thinking about what the computer has done. The obvious thing is time sharing, or at least it was obvious to me. So in '57, when I came to MIT on this fellowship, I proposed a simple form of it, but later it turned out that IBM, in connection with Boeing's desire to connect a wind tunnel to a computer, had invented or offered a system that had interrupts, which was clear to me that was really was going to work. That was what was really needed to be able to do time sharing. So we begged that from IBM and eventually got it, since MIT was in a position where it didn't pay for anything for that IBM 704. It begged, and it always took IBM a little while before they decided, in fact, to give it to us.
And so then, after they gave it to you, then somebody implemented, you helped somebody implement an actual time-sharing system?
Yeah, it was complicated. An assistant professor by the name of Herbert Teeger was going to implement it, but his ideas got very elaborate. So the person who actually did implement it on the 704 was Fernando Corbato. And also, I was a consultant at Bolt, Beranek and Newman, and I talked to Ed Fredkin, who worked there, and I said, of course, the PDP-1 computer is too small. BBN was getting the very first PDP-1 computer, and he said, no, it's not. He devised what hardware mods would be required for the PDP-1 for time sharing, and persuaded his friend Ben Gurley, who was the chief engineer for digital, to put them in. And then Fredkin went off, and I was left with the time sharing project at BBN. Got somebody to program it.
On the PDP-1?
On the PDP-1. It was ready in September of '62, which was the time when I left MIT to go to Stanford for the second time. And BBN didn't use it because there were so few users of the PDP-1 that it was still convenient to let somebody sign up for exclusive use of the machine.
Now, with regard to time sharing, of course, now computers are a lot less expensive and people can afford to have individual ones. And so, but still in all, even on these individual personal computers, there are versions of time sharing, right? In a sense.
What turns out, when personal computers were first invented, then people said, oh, we can get rid of this time sharing stuff. But then it turns out that if you want the computer to be printing at the same time you're doing something else or doing any other kind of task, you want time sharing anyway. So all of the basic software for time sharing is in modern operating systems, whether they be Microsoft or Apple, except that, at least with regard to the Windows, these features were sort of dragged in and were not done very well.
Of course, with Apple, based on Unix, they were already there. Right?
Yeah, once Apple did base it on
Once they did it.
Yep.
And what about at MIT? So you were leaving MIT at about that time, but Corbato and others carried on with time sharing with, was it Multics? Did that get started?
Well, what happened was that one of the people who was at BBN was J.C.R. Licklider, and I got him enthusiastic about time sharing. And then he went to ARPA and undertook to have a time-sharing project at MIT that he wanted me to be head of, and he was a little bit surprised when he discovered that I had disappeared.
You were back at Stanford.
Yep. And
so he had to find somebody else.
Yep.
And was that Corbato, or?
Well, MIT was rather hierarchical. So they put a professor of electrical engineering, Robert Fano, in charge, and Corbato under him, because Corbato was maybe just still an assistant professor or something like that. But it was Corbato who did the design and the actual work. Fano presided.
Anything else to say about MIT days before we move on to Stanford? You're leaving MIT, heading to Stanford.
Well, there was a big study that I ended up as, I wasn't the first chairman, but I ended up as chairman of it, that produced a report that said MIT's next computer should be time-shared. And MIT, I had made a big mistake. What I should have done was underestimated the cost of it. Instead, I was completely conservative and overestimated the cost of what it would be.
And that scared them?
That scared them into stalling.
I see.
So they wanted a market study. And I thought that a market study on the desirability of time sharing was like conducting a market study among ditch diggers as to whether steam shovels were a good idea. So when Forsyth at Stanford called me up and asked me to come to Stanford, I thought to turn him off by saying, I've been at Stanford before, I'd only come as a full professor. And he said, I think I can arrange that, which surprised me very much since MIT had just made me an associate professor.
So then we'll continue with Stanford days. So before we go on and talk a little bit about Stanford, let's conclude some of the discussion you had about time sharing. You had mentioned some things earlier about it.
Well, I've written up my recollections about it, and they're on my web pages, and also my January 1959 memo proposing it. But it got into the air, so to speak, very quickly, because basically speaking, the general idea can be expressed in just a few sentences. So the Dartmouth people got it from me, but which they have acknowledged, and DEC got it from me, which they have acknowledged in this book by Alan Newell and maybe Gordon Bell, I think. But still nobody's written it up properly as to, talk to everybody who was involved and said who did what.
So there's an invitation. Somebody ought to go and look at that in a very scholarly way, see who did what.
I should have, unless too many of the people who were involved are no longer functional.
Well, while we're on the subject of time sharing, apparently IBM, even though they provided the 704 that MIT used, they themselves didn't take to time sharing?
Yes and no, or maybe one should say no and yes.
namely the person who was in charge of IBM's next big computer, the 360, who was Gene Amdahl, decided that he didn't need to put any hardware into the 360 that was dedicated to time sharing. Now, MIT and IBM got into a dispute. And there were two aspects to this dispute. The first one was over money, namely whether IBM should pay MIT some large sum concerning the invention of core memory, which had been invented by J. Forrester at MIT, and that eventually got resolved after the heads of the two organizations resigned from each other's board of directors. The other was that after I left MIT, the committee that was in charge of time sharing came up with a very elaborate system involving pages and segments, which eventually led to Multics, which was, and IBM would not make the modifications to the 360 that were required for this. And so Corbato negotiated with General Electric, which would. And then at the last minute, IBM said, or somebody said to IBM, or Watson said actually, give them anything they want. And so IBM came up with this 360 Model 67, which did have all of that. But MIT had already decided to go with General Electric.
Who was making a computer at the time?
Yeah, General Electric was a competitor in the large computer game. But IBM did make this 360 Model 67 and did make their own time sharing system with it. But it was complicated and slow, in my opinion, because of the ideas that they took from the Multics proposal. Multics was never a success either. It had rings of protection and so forth, and it's had more elaborate protection than anyone has ever found it desirable to make sense.
Well, that's interesting that IBM was a little slow on that, and that was also the case, wasn't it, that even after Galerner did his work on geometry theorem proving, and maybe there's some other work in an AI, related to AI at IBM, IBM soon after lost interest in artificial intelligence?
It was more than losing interest. It was a development of actual hostility. There were two aspects of it. One aspect was a sort of sales aspect. I forget when, but maybe already as early as 55, IBM stopped using the word computer and talked about data processing machines, because these would be less frightening to their customer base. And then in 1959, somehow they decided that artificial intelligence was a bad idea and discontinued it.
So no more artificial intelligence work in the IBM laboratories until much later.
Yeah. IBM, artificial intelligence, has had its ups and downs at IBM.
So now, here we are at Stanford, and Forsythe was able to get a full professorship position for you at Stanford. This was in the math department at the time, was that right?
Well, the intention was to have a computer science department as soon as there were enough faculty. So it was a computer science division of the math department. So I came in the fall of '62. The computer science department was in fact established in February of '65.
65. And so what were some of the very early things you were doing at Stanford? You had a PDP-1 there, did you?
DEC gave me one. And then Suppies was interested in machine-aided instruction, and I convinced him that time-sharing was the way to go. And he arranged for us to get a joint grant from NSF that allowed greatly beefing up that PDP-1.
And then you put a time-sharing system on it.
And then we developed a time-sharing system for it.
And then, so was there some early artificial intelligence work that you did on that system?
Well, yes. On game playing, we did a game of Kala. And we're able to establish that if they were started with 3 stones in each pit, it was a win for the first player. That is, to prove that rigorously. We also, the programs indicated that it was a win for the first player with 4, 5, and 6, but we didn't have an actual proof of it. The PDP-1 was not powerful enough to do that.
Was there any work on chess at that time?
Not at Stanford.
Not at Stanford.
Or rather, actually, I started on a chess program when I was at MIT, and I taught the first course at MIT in programming for freshmen. And 3 of the people who finished that course took up my start of a chess program and wrote a chess program for the IBM computers in Fortran. And that was Alan Kotak's senior thesis. So he started out on it as a sophomore and finished it.
Now, your interest in artificial intelligence, of course, which got really going in pretty good shape along with the Dartmouth conference. You had written a paper which you gave in 1958 at Teddington.
Yeah, that
say a
was
little bit about
Programs
that?
with Common Sense. That was the first set of ideas that I had in which I retained confidence as that they were on the right track. As I told you, I didn't like the ideas that I'm involving automata that I discussed with von Neumann. And in the automata studies, I had a paper, Inversion of Functions Defined by Turing Machines, which basically had the same defect. It didn't really permit direct representation of common sense information.
So you wanted to be able to represent common sense information in some kind of language which was declarative, and you had thought about the use of logic. So do you want to say a little bit more about those ideas? They were described in your 1958 paper, but have been ideas you've been pursuing ever since, actually, right?
Well, that's correct. Basically, mathematical logic as invented by, Frege, I would say, in 1879. Of course, the formal logic goes all the way back to Aristotle, but Frege's system was the first one that was And that's good enough, in my opinion, for common sense. One needs some extensions for non-monotonic reasoning, and I think one also needs an extension for context as objects, but it's good enough. The logicians, however, have not been interested in pursuing common sense.
Now, that particular school of artificial intelligence, some have called it the logicist school, and there's been lots of controversy about it. I recently looked at an article again by Drew McDermott criticizing, even though he started out being interested in logic, criticizing the approach. So
Is that a recent article or his old article?
It was his old article. Mm-hmm. Anything to say about the pros and cons? I mean, some people say, well, look, humans aren't all that logical. A lot of what we do is not deduction, but something else. What would be your defense for logic against arguments of that sort?
Well, in the first place, that's right. A lot of the way people draw conclusions is not logical. But in the second place, people recognize the correctness of logical arguments, and quite apart from anything having to do with computers, if their arguments are incomplete as far as logic is concerned, people can be persuaded of that, or even that their arguments are wrong. So after all, logic was invented in terms of communication among humans, not specifically for the use of computers. Now, the people have had, from time to time, expectations of short-term success. And logic is one of those areas which has induced expectations of short-term success. Another one is neural nets and connectionism and so forth. And short-term success has eluded people. And so it looks like human-level artificial intelligence is quite likely to be a long-term proposition. At least it requires new ideas. And with regard to new ideas, you don't know when somebody's going to come up with it or not. Now, the current enthusiasm for short-term success is promoted by Ray Kurzweil. And I looked at, he wrote a book called The Singularity is Near, and I read his chapter on artificial intelligence. And as far as I'm concerned, he has not provided any sufficient basis for his short-term optimism. In fact, the chapter is not technical. It merely what it mainly consists of is reference to various demos.
So he's not pushing any particular point of view about what's going to lead to short-term success in artificial intelligence, right? He just says it's going to happen.
Yeah. And maybe it will and maybe it won't. But if it does, it won't be due to him.
He'll be there to help celebrate, he hopes, because he's also interested in extending his lifespan.
Yes.
Well, now, so somewhere around the time that Stanford decided to have a computer science department separate from mathematics, you helped start, or maybe did start, the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And under the acronym SAIL. Can you say anything a little bit about how that got started?
Well, when I came to Stanford, and I asked Licklider for some money to do work on artificial intelligence, and he gave me a fairly moderate grant. Then I began to think about what was required for vision, computer vision. And the dominant idea at that time, which is still rather prominent, is the making computer programs to do discrimination. For example, discrimination between the pictures of the letters of the alphabet.
Sometimes called pattern recognition or something like that.
Pattern recognition slogan is for something a little more systematic than that, I think. But the first things were using various ad hoc features. That is, does it have a hole in it? Well, that provides the beginning of a classification. Does it have something sticking down in it?
Selfridge was doing things like that, right?
I don't know whether he was or not. I wasn't thinking about him. But anyway, my idea was that you wanted description, not just discrimination. And my argument for that was that if you wanted to program a robot to pick up something, then it didn't just have to discriminate on the whole picture. It had to be able to locate the object and represent its shape. So I decided to try for robotics, and Licklider was gone by then, but I did apply and got a rather large grant or contract with DARPA to start the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. In particular, the amount of money required for our very own PDP-6 computer that later got beefed up into a PDP-10 and then eventually to a KL-10 and so forth.
Did you get some students interested in doing this description work of scenes?
Yeah.
And also you had some faculty who were, additional faculty involved with artificial intelligence work there?
Yeah, Jerry Feldman, for example, who came as an assistant professor.
And then Les Ernest, who wasn't a faculty member but came to help run the lab?
Yeah, when I started running the lab, after a while I told Ivan Sutherland that I wanted to hire an executive officer. And he said, yes, you should. You're the only one of our contractors who has a perfect record. You have never submitted a quarterly progress report.
At all, or on time? Or?
At all.
At all.
And he recommended Les.
Because he had known Les from Lincoln?
Yeah. And
then
Les took not only charge of that, but also was the substantial initiator of a number of the projects involving the time-shared applications of the computer, including PUB, which was the first really document-producing thing. Yeah.
There are a lot of other things besides artificial intelligence that might be regarded, I guess, as scaffolding for all these projects, but PUB would be one, and with some other work also, right? Graphics?
Yeah, there were at least one thesis on graphics and
Displays, different kinds of displays.
And control, that is, controlling the cart, and the another assistant professor who had got his PhD at Stanford with me as his advisor was Raj Reddy. And eventually he disappeared, as many of our assistant professors did, when we were ready to renew their appointment as assistant professors. And
Raj
other
Reddy.
schools were willing to make them a higher position.
Whereas other schools wanted to get started in this field or expand in that field. Raj Reddy went to CMU.
That's right.
Eventually became a dean there. All right, well, but there was also music, work on the use of computers in music too, right?
Yeah, well, that was a sort of hanger-on. Namely, I let them use the computer, but no ARPA money was ever spent on them.
Having a good computer around attracts a lot of people who have ideas that they'd like to explore on a good-sized computer.
Well, that's right. I mean, for a while, besides the IBM installation and some PDP-8 in various specific laboratories, we were the only general-purpose computer on campus.
And Knuth used it also, didn't he, for his typesetting work?
That's right.
Well, now, besides the robotics work that was going on and all of these other things that were using the computers that you had, what sort of work were you doing, or what sort of thoughts did you have at that time that extended your use of logic as a representation language and moving toward representing the information needed for human-level artificial intelligence?
Well, I did improve my representations of common sense and wrote some papers. But basically, the problem of representing common sense knowledge, either in logic or some other way, is still unsolved, or at least incompletely solved.
What about some
partially solved?
early attempts at the idea of implementing the ideas in your 1958 and other memos on the advice taker? There were some students who tried to implement some of those ideas.
Well, knowledge representation is a whole industry these days.
Well, I guess I was getting at people like
Or
Black
has
and
been for a long time, since the 70s.
Well, I guess I was getting at people like Black and Cordell Green and their attempts to actually use the situation calculus that you proposed.
That's right. Well, that was 69, Cordell Green.
But these were early attempts, but not completely. They certainly were not, didn't lead to the success that Kurzweil would have liked.
That's true. And every now and then, somebody comes along and says, well, you see, this hasn't got us to human-level intelligence, so my idea must be better. And then they make a lot of propaganda, get some money, and after a while, their idea doesn't lead to human-level intelligence right away either.
Well, these various ideas that people have tried.
Connectionism is the example that I want to give.
Connectionism, subsumption, Brooks-Bayes networks.
Yes.
Well, nevertheless, do you think that the combination of these ideas might, in fact, be useful?
I don't know. I mean, I think logic is fundamental.
Now, in terms of extending logic, you're also well known for your work on circumscription, which is one way of achieving a non-monotonic logic. Do you want to say some things about that? Non-monotonic logic in general and circumscription in particular?
Well, first of all, one can observe that people do non-monotonic reasoning. That is, draw conclusions from partial facts that they might not draw or would not draw if there had certain additional facts that do not contradict the partial facts. And so, fact is, you have to draw conclusions from partial information. And some people have jumped to the conclusion, maybe 100 years ago, that was probabilistic, but it turns out that that's not the only way in which humans jump to conclusions. So circumscription is a formalization in mathematical logic of this property, and I wrote 2 papers on it.
Mm-hmm. So it essentially involves something like well, there are various more simpler versions of non-monotonic reasoning and circumscription. There's, so for example, the default logics, and they're related to circumscription.
They overlap it. They're not simpler. The simple one is predicate completion, where you have some predicate and you say so-and-so implies this predicate, and you say so-and-so if and only if the predicate. That's predicate completion. And then there's negationist failure in prologue. That's simple in prologue, and it also existed in microplanar. Both of those date from the early 70s.
Isn't there a use also the database people make, in which if some particular fact is not in the database, you can assume that it's not true?
Well, that's sort of commonly done. I don't know to what extent it's qualified. In other words, if you have a database of Stanford students and you look up a name and it's not in the database, then you conclude that this person is not a Stanford student. So you assume that the database is complete, which you might not always want to do. Now, as for circumscription, it's based on the idea of minimizing the extent of a predicate, allowing certain things to be varied in order to achieve this minimum. So in that respect, it's very analogous to minimization in mathematics generally.
What are some other things, because you have other ideas that you've suggested would be important to achieve human-level artificial intelligence? Non-monotonic reasoning is one, but you've also investigated some other elaborations of logic also, haven't you?
Some of them are elaborations of logic, or at least one major one is an elaboration of logic. Many of them are things formalized within logic. that it doesn't require any extension of the logic. For example, concepts as objects.
You reify the concept.
Yeah, and you can do that within logic. And I advocate such reification as a competitor to modal logic. Now, the thing that, as far as I can see, does require an extension is contexts as objects.
So, if you were to sort of summarize what you think a new graduate student working in artificial intelligence might want to work on, in addition to all of the different things that come up, like connectionism, Bayes networks, other neural network techniques, subsumption. What are some of the core, what do you think a person ought to set about that he could actually, or she, make progress on in, say, a dissertation?
Well, representing particular domains of common sense knowledge is, in my view, the thing that will really give us the clues as to where we need to go towards human-level artificial intelligence. That being more important than, for the moment, than coming up with new general theories.
Mm-hmm. Well,
now there's some nice problems, like a person who has come up with a bunch of nice problems is Ernie Davis at NYU. And one can mention one of his, namely the birthday present problem. So A and B are thinking about a birthday present for C, and C must not know the birthday about what the present is in advance, and therefore A and B should not talk about it in the presence of C, and so forth. And to formalize all the necessary facts for that is something that I'm not sure whether there are any published attempts at that.
So formalizing particular, more or less circumscribed problems in which common sense is needed would be a good idea.
Yeah.
How many of those?
Consider the general notion of secrecy. Mm-hmm. One would presume if you want to do this birthday present problem, mm-hmm. then you ought to come up with some general notion of keeping something secret by, for example, not leaving the birthday present lying around, not talking about it, and so forth.
How many of these particular divisions do you think we would have to work on before making some progress toward general common sense? Are we talking about 6 of them, or 100 of them, or
20? Needless to say, if you really had even 10, somebody looking at the 10 might get some way of saying, well, there really aren't 10 there are only 3, and putting it together.
Now, if you look at psych as one example of trying to represent common sense knowledge, do you think psych includes a lot of these?
Well, it includes a lot. asked people to do various things for me in psych, and it's never really worked out. I can describe one example, and that was arranging for a dinner. And psych was able to say that, well, you need a table and you need silverware, but it didn't come up with you need only one table, but you need silverware for each diner. This was quite some time ago, so maybe psych is better in that respect. But somehow its representation of requirements for some action at least how it's used has not been adequate.
Now, if you were to...
He's holding us up.
5 minutes.
Oh, that's fine.
Now, if you were to pursue that kind of work with psych, trying to get it to reason about various things, and made notes of its inadequacies, would that, do you think, be a good way to proceed? Because for every one of these inadequacies, I suppose you could add something to psych.
Yes, that's a good idea, provided you doesn't mean John McCarthy.
Well, would it be a good idea for students to do something like that, do you think?
The trouble with any specific project is who knows that the student might end up spending all his time on the politics of psych, or on the sysadmin of psych. So the student would have to be, or his advisor would have to be capable of getting through those two things at least before the student would be really conceptualizing it.
You think that the effort that went into psych was worthwhile? That's a sort of thing that makes progress toward human level AI?
Yeah, I think so.
If so, should there be more of them that would have perhaps somewhat different points of view about how to proceed, and therefore...
Yeah, certainly. Quite different point of view about how to proceed, except that I'm not sure what this different point of view is. But, you know, Leonard made a real good try. I think more recently, in order to get support, he's undertaken to do whatever DARPA wants, and probably what DARPA wants is associated with various current slogans, which may not be the best path towards human-level AI.
One thing we haven't touched on, and maybe we could do this sort of to conclude, is your views on progress in learning. It looks like machine learning is an important topic in AI these days, and lots of people are involved using it for one thing or another, and control and so on. How about learning? What do you have to say about learning?
Well, the stuff that I've read about learning has been mainly discrimination and not learning, well, maybe how to describe things. And the example that I'd want to give is learning new concepts, like secrecy. But also, I have an example on my webpage about learning the three-dimensional reality behind a two-dimensional appearance. I have a little puzzle up there called, in my webpage, appearance.html that some people have played with. And the people who have done something serious with it are Stephen Muggleton and Ramon Otero, using inductive logic programming. But they haven't fully solved it yet.
Now, inductive logic programming is a variety of learning, isn't it, where one does more than just discrimination?
That's correct.
So there's a lot of possibility of learning statements there if one has what they call a bias or a...
Yeah, because I believe with inductive logic programming, you can learn something that has variables in it. At least free variables that are implicitly universally quantified. I don't know whether it goes up to learning the full predicate calculus sentences that can have alternations of quantifiers.
All right, well, that's interesting. Is there any further things you want to say in conclusion of the interview? To give a cheer to people who are doing work in artificial intelligence? If the goal is not around the corner, is it? Are we making progress?
There's something I would want, if you can do it, to stuff it in the middle somewhere. And that is when you were asking about the virtues of logic. The things that the logicians have proved, for example, Gödel's completeness theorem, in which he showed that anything that is true in all models of a given collection of sentences is provable. That from the point of view of AI, that's important. Probably more important than his subsequent incompleteness theorem, because nobody is expecting to make programs that can prove, that can decide arbitrary mathematical sentences.
So, although it's important to be able to show that something true in all models is provable, the detractors of the use of logic would say, well, that may well be, but it might not be provable in practice.
Well, that's so, but in limited domains, you can deal directly with models. And in fact, the satisfaction programs do that for a limited part of logic, namely propositional logic. So I guess the point I wanted to make there is that for AI, logic is inevitable in the same sense that for physical systems, calculus is inevitable.
So
stuff that in there somewhere.
We'll do that. So in conclusion, I think it's worth pointing out that McCarthy's websites have an awful lot of information. Pointers to papers, pointers to things like the original Dartmouth proposal, ideas that he's had on topics that might not have found their way into formal papers yet, plus a lot of information about some of John's opinions on matters outside of artificial intelligence. So, highly recommended to visit. The URL would be something like JMC at somewhere.
No. You better write it down.
You could Google John McCarthy.
Yeah. Problem is that the general systematic way of handling the URLs of faculty members came along after my particular URL was established. but Googling John McCarthy will
get you to
get you there.
everything. Okay, well, thank you very much, John.
There are several people who are said to be the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, and that's the reason why no woman has come forth and claimed to be the mother of artificial intelligence. So I want to talk about ideas that are precursors to the World Wide Web, about the current situation and how it compares with predictions of what would happen. I have to say that the predictions in question are almost all my predictions. The reason because that's what I'm familiar with. Okay, I would say the first major idea, or a major idea, we could go back further than that, is Turing's 1936 idea of the universal computer. And what universal means is that with a universal computer you can compute anything that any computer can compute by simulating this other computer. And that was a somewhat surprising result, I think, at the time. But it's a consequence. As a consequence of that, no computer manufacturer has ever claimed that his computer could compute something that other computers could not compute. So we've been at least saved that complaint. I should remark that before the universal computers, when you had the kind of desk calculator that you would press buttons on, it was true that some of them could compute things that others could not. Like the basic models could only add and multiply, and it was an additional step to be able to divide. Okay, so that's Turing. Now, the first computer that was actually built was built by Maurice Wilkes at Cambridge in England, and he called it the EDSAC. And John von Neumann and Eckert and Mauchly, their lawsuits about who did what, in 1946, discussed the stored program computer. So what stored program computer meant is that the program of the computer was in the same memory as the data. And computers that had been built before that, like the Harvard Mark I, did not have that characteristic. And the ENIAC did not have that characteristic. And it was thought at the time that it was fundamental that a program could change itself. This has become less important. Now, another important idea was proposed by Vannevar Bush, an American engineer and scientific administrator, and he proposed in an article something called the MEMEX, which would be an information station. And I won't go into the details of it because I don't remember them, but it doesn't mention universality, so he probably wasn't aware of Turing. The first person to really discuss artificial intelligence, although he didn't call it that, was Turing, and he gave a lecture to the London Mathematical Society in 1947. And now in the 70s, applications that people would pay money for came up, which is in some respects a distraction from pursuing the science. At least it has become such a distraction in the 90s. And sometime maybe in this century we will reach human-level artificial intelligence. But nobody has any plan that anybody else would believe is only a matter of applying money. and then you would reach human-level artificial intelligence. I get email once a week about someone who has such a plan. Now in 1958, I proposed formalizing common sense. That is, being able to write common sense in languages of mathematical logic, common sense knowledge, and to do common sense inference by some kind of logical inference. Now, the interesting thing about that is that this was an objective of Leibniz around 1700. It was an objective of Boole. He entitled his book The Laws of Thought. It was an objective from Frege. But when mathematical logic was developed, it proved that you could formalize mathematics in it, but the idea of formalizing, or the techniques for formalizing common sense, have been developed only slowly. Now one of my ideas was, I thought that, well, it would be really nice if I could sit at a computer terminal and talk to an artificially intelligent program and tell it things and interact with it, and it would take my advice and so forth. And computers were so expensive at that time that it seemed to me the only possible way of doing it was by time sharing, so that while I was scratching my head, it would be doing things for somebody else. So that technology was proposed in '59 and realized in a first system in 1962 by actually several people. J.C.R. Licklider was a psychologist in 1960, wrote an article called Man-Machine Symbiosis, which has had a lot of influence in popularizing, both among scientists and among the general public, the idea of interaction of human and computers. Larry Roberts, who as an executive at DARPA, proposed and implemented the ARPANET, which evolved through a succession of political maneuvers into the internet that we have today. An important technical device was by Douglas Engelbart, was the mouse, and which I was very skeptical about at the time, but I actually use it, although I use the IBM pointer stick on this computer. And the other idea that he promoted was linked documents. Alan Kay in 1970 proposed something called the Dynabook, which physically would have been like this laptop here, maybe a little bit smaller, but he imagined it to have much more access to information than you can get over the internet. Another major step was Tim Berners-Lee, who in the late 1980s and early 90s developed the World Wide Web. And then since that time has pursued a number of ideas that I regard as mistaken. But anyway, that was a very important thing, which developed enormously quickly. The reason was that it was built on top of existing tools, but the existing tools were not very usable as they stood. The file transfer protocol and so forth. And he made it so that people could really use it and could link documents together and so forth. And there were search engines before Google, but I think Sergey Brin and Larry Page really made the whole thing usable. In the previous search engines, you would search for something and you would give up before you got it, even though it was probably the 375th item if you had had only the patience to look that far. And Google is pretty good about about producing things that are useful to you relatively soon. I still find sometimes that it doesn't get what I want, but it's really extremely good. There were other prophets, and I'm neglecting them. Nelson, I'm even forgetting his first name, but anyway. Okay. Now, I want to put in some early predictions, and some of them worked out and others didn't, and some are working sort of and have further to go. Well, one of the first ones that I predicted and developed, I didn't develop it, but developing time-sharing made it possible. And the idea was that you would have a time-shared public utility, so you would have some kind of terminal at home, initially a typewriter, later, of course, a display terminal, and you would be a client of this public utility service. And there were a number of time-sharing companies formed. They were not very successful. They had to charge too much, was the basic problem, and they spent close to 90% of their expenses on hand-holding the customers. Now, time-sharing and utilities worked fine in computer labs, and basically everyone adopted them. Now, one of the things that we did at Stanford in the Artificial Intelligence Lab in 1972 was to make a news service based on the Associated Press wire, which they let us use for the student newspaper price of $15 a month. And so we had it in the lab, and DARPA liked it as a demonstration, but needless to say, the AP was not in favor of our making their thing generally available. So that lasted from 1972 to 1989, when we switched computers and didn't redo the program, and anyway, AP was getting very nervous. The New York Times had cut us off long ago. Okay. Now, one of the things that was predicted, or that proposed, I would say, was access to all the world's books. And in 1972, I got to see the President's science advisor and suggested that the U.S. use $2.5 billion in blocked Indian rupees to get the Indians to type in the Library of Congress. He said he had no power, and anyway, Nixon fired him in a couple of months later. Not for that, I hope. Now, still, there are some books available. John Ackerbloom at the University of Pennsylvania has links to more than 20,000 free-to-read books, and anything that whose copyright expired by 1920 and is of importance so that some English department or something like that will get it into the computer. There are lots of things available. Jane Austen is all available. Shakespeare is all available. A good part of Kipling is available, and so forth. English literature. I don't know whether anybody's done that in other languages. Okay, online buying and selling, and I don't think anyone predicted eBay in 1970. So there were some things that were not predicted. Well, access to all the world's books hasn't happened because of the lack of an economic model, which makes sure that the writers and the publishers will be rewarded. Now, my opinion is that the writers should be rewarded, and the publishers should suffer a substantial degree of technological unemployment, but that may actually be mistaken. We got a brochure in which Elsevier explained why commercial scientific publishers were very important because they are suffering a lot of stress from the development of online scientific journals. The key thing that works for science and doesn't work for literature is that science is produced by projects, and the page charges that the online journals charge are a small part of the cost of doing the research. Therefore, it's reasonable to say that the author pays, with exceptions for authors that don't have institutional support. And the biologists have pioneered that. Okay, now as to online use of computers, how many people here have never seen a punched card? I guess that punched cards have lasted longer in this in this country than elsewhere. Now, the best time-sharing system in terms of operation was the Digital Equipment Corporation series of the PDP-6, PDP-10, DEC System 10, DEC System 20, and so forth. And they never made really powerful machines in that series because they were afraid of IBM, or at least that's what some of their people told me. Now, as to personal computers, MIT developed the TX2, MIT Lincoln Lab, around 1960 with a lot of nice facilities. It was a personal computer, but it was $500,000. So only one was ever built. Later on, in 1975, the first Sun was a good personal computer, but it was only a mere $20,000. Now, the IBM PC was too weak initially, but was designed as a single-user computer, and it didn't even time-share processes like printing with the user's computing, and that was an add-on. And first of all, it was done badly because of having fixed allocations of space and so forth, various bad ideas. But many of the weaknesses of the early PCs have been kept in much stronger computers. The PC hell is system administration, that is installing programs and so forth. And you need artificial intelligence to do it properly on a mass scale. You were looking at your watch. When should I stop? Well, I'd like to know. Okay, well, these are sort of just general grumbles. Operating systems require the user to do system administration for every new version. I just had the disk replaced on a Macintosh, and that was a disaster. that I have not yet fully recovered from. Namely, nothing is where I left it, even though the disk hadn't actually crashed, so that they were able to copy this stuff. But nevertheless, we fix Macs. Didn't fix it enough for me. Now, one thing which sort of goes back to the time-sharing idea is the so-called set-top box, where you would use a TV as a display and so forth. And that seems to be an idea of 5 years ago that seems to have dropped out. And the reason may have been that it was the people who were offering it were aiming at monopoly of services, but in general, too little and too late. One would much rather have a laptop or other PC and not have one's hand held by, I forget the company that was doing that, Adobe maybe, or not Adobe. Okay, the present web is pretty good. The users will do okay even without new ideas. In my opinion, there's a shortage of good new ideas. And that a lot of the flashy claims that one sees, both on the part of the companies themselves, but on the part of people who comment, are not good ideas. And my own view of the dot-com crash was that there were just too many bad or trivial ideas. Now, everyone has trouble using something new. And no matter how much experience you have of using some things, other things are going to come up for which you are a beginner. And you will have typical beginner's troubles. And my opinion on this is that a major development that's required is for the systems to understand the user's confusion. How is he confused? And I've got a trivial example. A user is asked for an IP address, and he types a URL. Or an email address. And a present program that is expecting an IP address will say, sorry, that's not the right format. A smarter program would say, oh, you've just given an email address. That's not the same as an IP address. If you want to know, if it isn't just a slip on your part, I'll tell you the difference. And that's the way a human who was looking over your shoulder and was experienced with computers would do it, and the computers themselves have to do it. But I say that's a trivial example because states of confusion are often vastly more complicated than that. Okay, and now here's where I'm disagreeing with some people, that there are a fad for emotional computing, for sympathetic computing, and so forth. And I just have this picture in mind of somebody sitting at your elbow who's supposed to help you, but understands absolutely nothing about how you are confused, and pats you on the shoulder and says, I feel your pain, and so forth. I think it will only produce annoyance. It really has to have some understanding of what you need to know. Okay, now I'm going to go back to an ancient paper of mine, 1970, in which I predicted the world of the future. And what I have is a bunch of quotes from it, interspersed in blue by more up-to-date comments on what worked and what didn't. So one of the things that I said in 1970 is of what a newspaper or a book is, a package produced by a large organization. And I thought that physical production would disappear, allowing much smaller organizations to put out the same packages of text and pictures. That hasn't really happened yet. One of the things that I underestimated, see, Life and Look were American publications at the time I wrote this thing. People will be able to get anything they want, and will be able to get individual, there will be individual competition. And that hasn't quite worked out, and I think not merely for technological reasons. So I underestimated the resistance to being displaced these organizations would be able to mount. Even the publication organization of nonprofit scientific societies have been able to resist displacement, like American Physical Society and so forth. The ACM, AAAI has. Once you've created a bureaucracy, then it's going to maintain itself. So the biologists have taken the lead in creating online journals, page where things work. Now, the blogs come closest to my predictions, but they still can't afford famous professional writers who are often very good and much better than the less famous ones. One of the things that came out in the last American election campaign is that some of the political bloggers were actually able to make money by advertisements. And that fits in with my 1970 model of the world of the future, whereby an individual could compete with the large organizations, at least find a place among the large organizations. And we'll see how that develops, since the commentators didn't remark on it until just after the last American election. So what's a publication? It's put out a list of material that it recommends to its readers, and it has a financial arrangement with them. And there can be a variety of publications. Now, in 1970, I ignored the copying problem. I didn't think about that. It's turned out to be very serious. I don't know quite what the situation, or what the solution is. I think that Richard Stallman, who has been a hero in many respects, has been a negative force in his view that everything should be free and no one should have to pay for anything, unless Stallman would think of a mechanism where my daughter, who is a professional writer, would still be able to make money. I said he's had some negative effects. One of the things that probably hasn't got too much to do with computers, it has to do with the phenomenon of stars. Now, you have movie stars, you have sports stars, you have writers who are stars, and so forth. And what's increasingly happening with the most publicity in sports, where some young person who is one of the world's most talented person at this particular activity can immediately make hundreds of millions of dollars. And why should that be so? And it's so because for the people who hire people like that, the best guy is a lot better than the second best, or at least it's worth a lot more money to have the best guy. And my opinion is that this will continue and get more prominent in the future, because while the population will increase, say the UN predicts 9 billion by the middle of this century as opposed to 6 billion now. What will really happen is increased equality of opportunity. In other words, when the market includes 1.2 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians, as added to the American and European markets, then there will be an increased opportunity for stars, and they will make vastly more money than they do today. I don't know that that's, I think society will survive that. Certainly society has survived Bill Gates being so rich. Okay, so a reader will be able to get help, and my opinion is that the facilities for providing help, which after all have always existed in the form of book reviews and publications, have not improved to the extent to which is possible. At least I'm often finding out at random something that I want. I asked Herbert Simon once complained to me, he said, we're drowning in this glut of information. Now, people have been complaining about that since the year 1700, or maybe 1600, when printing made possible more books than anybody could possibly read. And so I asked him, well, has it ever happened that you saw a publication that if only you'd seen it 10 years earlier would have greatly affected your work? And he said no. And I asked him, well, why not? And he said, because people tell me what I should read. Well, there were people to tell him what to read. I wouldn't say that that's that I would make quite the same claim. Now, I was hoping advertising would mainly go away, and that was didn't happen. And perhaps fortunately, at least advertising supports the production of a lot of worthwhile material. Although I don't understand it in one sense. I almost never buy anything on the basis of seeing it advertised. At least I don't think I do. Somebody could say, well, no, you bought this, and surely, and it was caused by the repetition of the name. But since I don't watch TV, I'm not that affected. Now, another thing that I predicted was that there would be frequent revisions of articles and books. An author can take into account new facts or other people's criticism, and the revision would take effect immediately. There's been a little bit of that. I frequently revise the web versions of old papers, or put dated footnotes in it, but it certainly hasn't happened very much. Now, here was something, public controversy could be carried out more expeditiously. If you read something that seems controversial, you can ask if anybody's filed a reply. And I was hoping that this, together with an author's ability to revise the original statement, would lead people to converge on considered positions more quickly than at present, even if they do not come to actual agreement. And maybe that's happened a little bit. I'm still sort of hopeful for the future, but I didn't see it happening in this philosophy meeting. Well, to set up formally discussions of some controversial, if you can find some issue where there are yes or no sides, then the yes and no's might hit on considered positions as best they can by iteration. So I'm not going to do it, but you should do it. Okay, now here in 2000, I was suggesting that there would be truth squads with putting on websites. And now what happened in 2004 is that they did more of that. And so in the US, and maybe in 2008, they'll do a lot more. Then I said famous authors will not need publishers because the readers will have the system find their stuff automatically. Remember, I was thinking about time-sharing systems rather than the internet, but Google will find you stuff. But now, what was the author who tried that, who put a book up on the web for Stephen King or something? Yeah, anyway, for him it was a disaster because the thing was just repeatedly copied and he hardly got paid for it at all. So, got to think of some other mechanism. Now, again, this was the question of revision, and the bloggers, it seems to me, just bombard their opponents with new things rather than revising their previous opinions. Okay, now one of the things that really has happened is online ordering and online announcement of products and so forth. That's certainly happened to a great extent. Somehow I imagine it'd be more revolutionary than it did, but anyway, it has happened. So making airplane or hotel reservations by interacting with programs has certainly worked out quite fine, and I don't know when it became possible. Remember, the paper predicted it in 1970, and it came about maybe around 85 or 90 or something like that you could do that. Now here's another one that hasn't happened. Individual design and construction services, where the extreme example is I'd like a car to my specs that has the features that I wanted, and not merely a collection of options and things like that. And there's nobody who will design a car to my specifications and then have it automatically produced on the same production line as producing other cars with other designs. So cars would be an extreme, but anyway, it hasn't happened. Computer programs, now there's certainly fair competition in that. And even if I do find it too confusing and haven't really mastered downloading, but my son has mastered it very well and does it for me. By the way, I should mention, why is it that my son does it so much better than I do? And my feeling is that you learn your first thing that you do very well, and then subsequent things less well. So that if you really wanted to know how to write a program in symbolic assembly language for the IBM 704, I could really advise you, or the DEC PDP-1. except for certain sentimentalists who actually have simulators for those ancient computers. Nobody does that. So my 1970 article did not see AI as essential as I see it now to help people use computers. So I was working on AI then, but it was in my mind a separate topic. So this slide is not very good because I should have put a lot more in it. But the truth is that I didn't have a lot more ideas here. So you want a swindle predictor. Now, it's amusing to be able to identify all possible variants of the Nigerian scam, which has involved a lot of creativity, but still they can be detected and deleted easily enough. So anyway, I don't have know how to make a program that knows about swindles in general. Swindles from respectable sources are sort of interesting. I get a lot of bombardment from United Airlines, and some of it seems to me pretty close to being swindles. So here's more about IP addresses and URLs, but I don't think it says anything much different than I said in elaboration of what I said before. System administration requires knowledge and reasoning, and my evidence for that is that the people who spend several hours fixing my problems always obviously think a lot, because I feel ashamed sometimes that I can't fix this thing myself. And so I get an expert to do it for me, and the expert takes 3 hours. And that makes me pleased that I asked him rather than trying to do, because it would probably taken me 20 hours. What? I think I should quit pretty quick. Okay, I will. So I think I'll skip this part about logical AI. It's what I think is necessary for human level AI, but I won't, but he's rattled me. So some facts is that humans mainly communicate in facts, not in rules or programs, and people reason to get new facts from old. And that next point is a technical one. And okay, future of the web, part 2. That should be part 1. Programs that understand substantial parts of natural language document, facts about the world, facts about people's states of mind, including confused states of mind. I keep pushing the button, there aren't any more slides.
Professor John McCarthy, once Turing recipient, yes. At that time that he received the Turing Award, he was so busy that he said, I could only deliver a talk, but I have no time to write it down. And only after 10 years he wrote down. And in the introduction of the story he wrote down, he said, now I set my mind back to 10 years ago, and I will write down what I thought at that time, and then I give some notes what I think now. And that was the beginning of what you saw, because he continued this habit to give notes now and then on his thoughts. And so we got this afternoon an excellent insight in what this scientist, this I would say one of the best scientists we have produced over the last 30 years. I think that some of you did not completely understand the depth of his thoughts, because he said it a little bit, but I will tell you, if you are 80 and you have such a productive period behind you, you have taken notes over that whole period, it is absolutely excellent. And so one more applause for this scientist. Some people who know me are, some of them, very few, and sometimes I'm reproached for that, are a little bit afraid for me. Because in my students' environment, I sometimes give questions which people are obliged to pose. And also in this environment, I have one person who will give I the task to have a question, and that's Arjen Sevenster. Now I give questions. I give the floor to people who would like to have 2 informative questions, and then we start the panel. Who could I give the microphone to have a question? Yes, over there.
You mentioned common sense reasoning. What has become of that? Sorry? You mentioned common sense reasoning. Yes. In the beginning of your talk. What has become of that now? What is what?
What is, how good is a computer at this moment in common sense reasoning? What is the performance of a computer now?
Okay. Some aspects of common sense knowledge and reasoning are understood, and the parts that are understood, you can write computers to do them, computer programs to do them, or use general purpose reasoning systems. Others are not understood. Let me give an example which is not understood well. Game of chess, as we know, computer programs have been written that can beat the world champion with the aid of enormously fast hardware. But in the game of Go, the very best computers, in spite of very substantial effort, are far behind human performance. And the reason is that there's an intellectual mechanism used in Go which is not required for chess. And that is to be able to take the overall situation, divide it into parts, analyze the parts, and the division depends on what the current situation is. It's not a fixed division into dividing the board into quarters or eighths or something like that. And analyze the parts separately and then analyze their interaction. So that's an area which hasn't been of common sense reasoning, which hasn't been solved yet. But in general, the whole area of common sense reasoning is in quite weak state.
Thank you. So, if you may understand, we are on our way. And if we may believe what John McCarthy states, that is that we will arrive at our goal. And I would say the date of arriving, the arrival time, I would say, is open for the debate later on this afternoon. Second question. Yes?
Oh, XML is a loser.